The first decades of the 20th century saw many, many new trends emerging in art and architecture. And this would radically really reshape the vision of design. And we see this very clearly where movements in art would trickle to other areas of aesthetic development in writing, sculpture, and architecture. So it's kind of hard to find where one ends and one begins. One of the most important of these trends was Cubism. And this was an artistic movement that served as a motivating force of the Parisian avant-garde. Now, the term avant-garde is an important one for us today. It comes from military terminology. So you may be familiar with the idea of the rear guard. That would be the soldiers or the unit of the armed forces that were bringing up sort of the rear, watching the end of the forces moving through an area. The avant-garde comes from the French, so avant means in front of or before, and garde, of course, comes from this idea of a unit of troops, for example. So avant-garde means something that forges ahead, a group that forges ahead. When we apply it to art and architecture, it is taken to mean new and unusual or experimental ideas, especially, of course, in the arts. And we also refer to avant-garde art, so it's an adjective in that regard, but also the people who are making these arts. So it's a noun and adjective, and I'll be using it today, and it's one that you should be familiar with from reviewing your textbook materials. So back to Cubism, this avant-garde movement in Paris. It was largely inspired by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, pictured here. And Cubism stressed a multi-viewpoint fragmentation in art. What does that mean? Well, if you think of a traditional landscape, for example, usually there's one primary perspective, and that is what we are meant to be focusing on. And it's relatively realistic. So there's a foreground, a background, etc. Now, Cubism, even though the examples of it we'll look at seem completely out of sequence with earlier art movements, it actually follows quite a long line of reformation in art that stretch back to, say, the Impressionists. If you think of Monet's paintings of the water lilies, for example, that impressionistic view. Cubism was an analytical method. It's based on painterly traditions and scientific ideas of the time. So here is a mix already of art, hugely influenced by scientific developments and philosophical developments. So from science, many historians actually ascribe Einstein's theory of relativity as an influence on the thinking of the Parisian avant-garde, because now time is one of the dimensions. Of the two, Braque and Picasso, Braque's approach was more analytical, and it would significantly impact Picasso's thinking when the two met in 1909. The close and competitive working relationship between these two artists is a pretty amazing story. And it is one of the sort of generative stories in the history of modern art. So Braque, conjuring a bit sort of this idea of mountaineering, the two of them climbing together, said, quote, "We were like climbing partners roped together," unquote. By this, of course, he meant that as one would advance, they'd pull the other along, and then they would share the lead. And this is actually how most historians do look at their development. They pushed each other to really reach new and unusual places in art at the time. Picasso is a bit more condescending, and he actually said in this intense period of give-and-take growth that Braque worked more as if he were Picasso's wife. It's clear, however, for art historians that there was a partnership, was certainly equal, and they each had turns pushing the other to try and experiment with new forms. Together, the two artists began a series of explorations which radically broke down our traditional sense of pictorial space. So the pictorial quality of painting was completely changed. And by this, we now no longer have that one viewpoint. Instead, each image would collapse the view, many views, into one frame. So you wanted the impression of looking at an object from a number of different viewpoints at once. The image right now on the slide is a good one. This is Picasso's L'Aficionado from 1912. And if you look closely, you can start to distinguish elements of a face, the body, their words, other images here. The presence is quite elusive, but they're clues to the image scattered and compressed throughout the surface of the painting, as though one were to capture these different views from all sides of the figure and then collapse them into one image. Here are a couple of other images. This is actually the way these two works used to be hung in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And I show them to you here because this is Man with a Guitar by Braque and Majoli by Pablo Picasso, because you can see quite clearly that they were working in a very similar genre, and they pushed each other. In fact, if you're not an art historian, it might be difficult to know who had painted which image. So there's one last thing I will mention here before we move on to the next slide, and a few other examples from Cubism, is that we have a very analytical approach, right? So taking many views of one object, fragmenting them, and then recompiling them into a single view. And there's also symbolic meaning. So we've got a combination of analysis, symbolism, and then, of course, abstraction. So taking something and abstracting it to its bare elements. Another part of Cubist art is intuition. And this is something we, if Braque was a little more analytical, we would say that Picasso was more intuitive. So we know that Picasso was drawn to the tribal masks and carvings in Africa, and he felt that these new images, sort of like the one you see here on the right, allowed him, sort of freed him from older constraints to explore new possibilities. After studying these kinds of vernacular and what he referred to at the time as primitive arts, Picasso said, quote, "A head is a matter of eyes, nose, mouth, which can be distributed any way you like it. The head remains a head," unquote. So the abstract quality of this mask, the elongated zone of the eyes, the triangulated nostrils, we still recognize it as being a face. And so in his own work, Picasso sought that same vital energy which he valued so much in this type of primitive art. So Cubism was a huge influence and really one of the first avant-garde or abstract art movements that we can identify very clearly as having set objectives. Now moving on, I want to talk just very briefly about this figure because we're going to see him again later when we're talking about the Bauhaus, where he was a teacher. Vasily Kandinsky was an artist. He also wrote. He was somewhat of a philosopher about arts and the creative process. And he wrote a very important essay called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. So I've already mentioned that in Cubism anyway, we've got symbolic, yes, we've got the analytical, we have the intuitive. And Kandinsky goes further and says there is spiritual in art. And this is an important quote. "Every work of art is the child of its age, and in many cases the mother of our emotions." So the child of its age. This is related to the idea of the zeitgeist, or the spirit of its time. And so for Kandinsky, each piece of art was a lens. And also, and this part of the quote about the mother of our emotions, it's not only a lens, but it also is something that helps to form and reform the way that we deal with the world. So his key points in this essay are that art evolves, that art is reflective of its time and place, that art carries with it that spirit of its time, or the zeitgeist, and this huge emphasis on the artistic spirit. And it's important, and the reason I bring up Kandinsky here is that as people are making art, right, people like Braque, people like Picasso, there are others, like Kandinsky as well, who are also making and writing about it and thinking about the creative process and what it means to be an artist in the early 20th century. Here's some examples of Kandinsky's work. You can see that he tried many different expressions, lots of exploratory work. So for Kandinsky, he was not interested in a kind of objective reality, which later characterized abstract art, right? That it was objective, not subjective. Instead, Kandinsky's feeling was that abstract art could in fact be very subjective. It could express an emotive strength. And he broke down all these images you can see here into colliding forces. And some would say it was even prophetic of World War I, which of course was just around the corner. Interestingly, he referred to his paintings as compositions because he saw them as a form of visual music. So with these things in mind, Kandinsky writing and thinking about art and making it, and then Picasso and Braque's work of forming Cubism, gives us to sort of this idea of modern abstract art. And there are a few different ways that it's defined, and this is by no means a comprehensive lecture on the subject, but we're going to pull out those elements that will be important, particularly for our study of architecture. So first of all, modern art and abstract art is the expression of the artist's right to freedom of choice. One can do anything. You're not limited by tradition. We no longer have to have literal representation, so it doesn't need to be realistic. Once photography was developed, we had the camera if we wanted to capture something in that moment. But now art was freed from that constraint and could go much further. It could be arts for art's sake, so all about the making, the process of making, or not. Remember, this goes back to the artist's right of freedom. And then the idea of rejecting tradition, and in many of the different avant-garde movements we'll be looking at this week, also of society, so of the status quo, and saying, you know what, we need something different. Look at the politics. Look at the social issues that we're encountering. How can art play a role in bettering or drawing attention to these conditions? So in the rest of this lecture, and then on into avant-garde lecture part 2, we'll be looking at a bunch of different modern art and abstract art movements from the turn of the century through to sort of the mid-century. And from these, we'll try to draw some ideas about how art influenced architecture, but also the way that these creative peoples were thinking about their world and the place of art and architecture within it. One of the first movements that we'll talk about following Cubism is Dadaism. So Dadaism emerged really amid the brutality of World War I. So as you can see from the dates, 1916, the war was ongoing. And that conflict, as we saw last week, is one that claimed the lives of 8 million people and an estimated equal number of civilians, so 8 million military personnel and at least 8 million others. This was an unprecedented loss of human life. And we know it was a result of trench warfare and also technological advances in weaponry, communications, and transportation systems. For the delusioned artists of the Dada movement, the war merely confirmed the degradation of social structure that had led to such violence. So corrupt nationalistic politics, repressive social values, and unquestioning conformity of culture and thought. Emerging from these positions, from 1916 until the mid-1920s, artists in Zurich, New York, Cologne, Hanover, and Paris, so many different countries, declared an all-out assault against not only conventional definitions of art, but on rational thought itself. The beginnings of Dada, the poet Tristan Tzara recalled, quote, were not the beginnings of art, but of disgust, unquote. So Tristan Tzara was our key figure, the founder. He was born in Romania in 1896, and he lived most of his life in Paris. As I think you're probably getting the sense here, Paris was a pivotal city during this period for avant-garde movements. He was a writer, and Tzara wrote the first Dada text, and also wrote a series of manifestos. Later in life, he became an active member of the French Communist Party. And it should be emphasized that many of these artists were political in nature, and that part of the goal of their manifestos was to position art for or against specific political movements. Now, Tzara is credited with founding Dadaism, and there remains sort of an interesting story about how this name was selected. So as the story goes, the name Dada was either chosen at random by stabbing a knife into a dictionary, or consciously selected for the variety of connotations in different language. So Dada in French means hobby horse, and in Russian means yes, yes. And so many of these different groups, all those countries I mentioned, it may have had sort of tongue-in-cheek changing meaning. And so this was very intentional to have almost a ridiculous name. So participants in the group would claim humorous definitions for it, even though their work was seen as quite serious. So Dada was meant to be ironic, it was meant to be anti-art, and the word itself is really almost a nonsense utterance. So Dada's subversive and revolutionary ideas emerged from the activities of Tzara and in other small groups of artists, starting in Zurich, Switzerland, moving to Paris, and then elsewhere. And eventually it cohered into a set of strategies and philosophies adopted by this loose international network. These were all artists who wanted to create new forms of visual art, performance, and poetry, as well as alternate visions of the world. So again, using art as a way of changing society. Also, notice the inter and multidisciplinary nature of Dadaism, so visual arts, performance, and poetry. It was meant to be unlimited in terms of its expression. The artists affiliated with Dada did not share a common style or practice, so much as the wish to destroy the evil and negativity of the past and to discover something better. The role of the visual arts in Dadaism. So for the Dada artists, the aesthetic of their work was considered secondary to the ideas it conveyed. So the Dada poet Hugo Ball said it best, I think, when he says, quote, "For us, art is not an end in itself, but is an opportunity for the true perception and criticism of the time we live in," unquote. Dadaists embraced and critiqued modernity. They imbued in their work reference to technology, newspapers, film, and advertisements that increasingly defined contemporary life. And so one of the things that we definitely see is the emergence of the collage, which allows this layering of many different media and message. That comes with Cubism, but very clearly in Dadaism. Characteristics of Dada art: nonsensical, use of collage and layers, meant to confuse and require the intense intellectual engagement of the viewer. The beginnings of surrealism. So many of these artists would go on to participate in other art movements, and many to surrealism. And then the subject matter is often quite mundane. So it's not about kings and queens and the aristocracy, but rather about the objects of daily life. These individuals and their works they made were experimental, provocative. They're reimagining the art and art making could be. They used unorthodox materials, and it was meant to be almost spontaneous and certainly irreverent. One central figure that you may be familiar with is Marcel Duchamp, and he declared common manufactured goods to be ready-made artworks. And he's probably most famous to the average individual for having put a commode in a museum exhibition. And here's a list of some of the key figures. In the next few slides, I'm going to move through some examples of Dada art. And what I want you to be thinking about is how materials are used, the use of abstraction, the everyday, and also color and typography. Here, of course, a machine turned quickly, technology, and progress are key themes in modern abstract art. The use of text is very important. Collage and photomontage. In this case, assemblage, where you mix multimedia into a single image. Abstraction, zones and blocks of color. Complete removal of the object here, much more focused on color and form. This is a poster for a Dada soiree. Again, look at the use of typography and also color. Marcel Duchamp. Those are just a few tiny number of the many works that were created within the Dada movement. I also want to emphasize the many publications. So this is not just an art movement, but also included poetry and theater. And Dada, in fact, was a publication that was put out starting in 1917. And this was focused on literature, but also art. And it was a review that was published and organized by Sarah. And then, as I've listed here on the slide, there are many other publications that came out of the Dada movement, including, you'll notice, De Stijl, which went on from being a publication to being sort of a separate offshoot, a new movement that had direct implications for architecture. Here's an example of some of the graphic design work on the Dada magazine. So the magazines themselves and these articles from De Stijl and Dada become artworks in and of themselves, an integration of review, of text, and art. So Dada movement was very important, partly just because it did bring together a coherent set of ideas, and also it had all these offshoots. I want to mention here just briefly a group that emerged in Germany in the 1920s known as New Objectivity. And it was a challenge to Expressionism. So as the name suggests, it offered a return to unsentimental reality and a focus on the objective world. Right? So this is a little different than what we're seeing with the other avant-garde abstract art groups. So New Objectivity opposed itself to the more abstract, romantic, or idealistic tendencies of Expressionism. This style is most often associated with portraiture, and its leading practitioners included Max Beckmann and Otto Dix. And what they did is they had these naturalistic depictions of people. Sometimes they're reminiscent of the meticulous process of the old masters' portraits. But they often also took on kind of a satirical, sometimes caustically satirical manner when they would portray Weimar society. So here you can see, right, this is a portrait. It is meant to look like the person, yet it's also making a statement about them. So not abstracted in the way that we've been seeing with those other groups, yet it certainly is telling a story, a narrative about that person and his character. Here's another example. And the reason I'm mentioning New Objectivity here is I don't want you to think that we've got just a couple of movements like Cubism and Dadaism that focus on this extreme abstraction, because in fact you have simultaneously these other groups also critiquing society and art, right, and generating something new, yet in quite a different way. So in this way, natural, without any of the sort of what we might say today, photoshopping, right? None of those improvements that one would normally see in a portrait to show an individual off to their best advantage. So I'd already mentioned that De Stijl was a movement that came out of Dada, and we sometimes call De Stijl neoplasticism as well. This group was around from 1917 to 1931, and it included primarily painters originally, Theodor van Doesburg, Piet Mondrian, and Bart van der Lek. And there are also architects as well, so J.J.P. Oud, and as we'll see later, Schroeder. The De Stijl movement emerged largely in response to the horrors of World War I. Right, so World War I, we saw some art movements before that were avant-garde, but the war itself sort of turned things upside down. And these artists wished to remake society in a better way after the destruction of the war. De Stijl did view art as a means of social and spiritual redemption. Following Cubism and Dada, these practitioners saw abstract art as a visual language that would allow for this kind of social and spiritual language, spiritual redemption. They particularly liked extreme abstraction, so geometric forms and primary colors. And they moved away from some of the sort of more personal and subjective qualities, say as New Objectivity, which is telling something about an individual, towards the extreme abstraction of geometry and primary colors. And as the quote here expresses, this is what they were doing. They're searching for, quote, the universal, as the individual was losing its significance. unquote. De Stijl, as I mentioned earlier, published a magazine. The first magazine came out in 1917, and it promoted a rational, mechanistic approach to art and architecture, very abstract. De Stijl itself was a very loose-knit group. So these designers didn't necessarily think of themselves as being De Stijl. It was primarily based in Rotterdam, Holland. And the principal figure is really Theo van Doesburg, because he brought together these architects and artists under the banner of this particular publication. And here he is. So van Doesburg was a multidisciplinary artist, painter, architect, designer, typographer, art critic, poet, editor, publisher. He tried it all. And he was in pursuit of changes in all of these disciplines. And most of all, he was looking for a synthesis of art and life. So he called himself a constructor of the new life. He founded the De Stijl magazine as a platform for spreading these ideas. And as the editor, he became the group's primary spokesman. And from 1920 onwards, he traveled around Europe, Belgium, France, Germany to promote De Stijl. He lectured, wrote articles in international publications. He later, as we'll see, gave De Stijl courses in Weimar to the students of the Bauhaus. He organized congresses, conferences, and exhibitions, founded other magazines and artist collectives, and befriended foreign artists from other avant-garde groups. Because of all this work and his varied activities, van Doesburg became one of the most pivotal people within European avant-garde. He wanted to express a new utopian ideal of spiritual harmony and order. And the best way to do this, he felt, was through universal forms, pure abstraction. And so in this particular image, this is a Mondrian painting. What you would do is, instead of, say, showing a landscape or a portrait, art would be simplified to vertical and horizontal elements, lines, planes, dots, and it would be very, very carefully framed. So the goal was to create a precise mechanical order that he and others within the group felt was lacking in the natural world. In the next few slides, we'll look at a few examples of De Stijl art. So this is one of Theo van Doesburg's own pieces. Notice the use of geometry here to lay out and organize the page. Piet Mondrian, a number of his pieces here. You're probably most familiar with his gridded color block paintings, so I wanted to show you a few of his other works. Again, this is called Flowering Tree. Very, very abstracted to the basic elements of the tree, of the way the branches might work. And here we see the emergence of more of that gridded form, but again, look at the color tones, blue, gray, very, very pale pink overlaid on some of the gray. And here on the right, a more familiar piece from the Tate Gallery in London, one of his compositions. This one is Yellow, Blue, and Red of 1939. Now, how did this affect architecture? So, Cubism had many effects, but it's hard to actually trace it directly to a Cubist architecture. Dada as well. There are no architects practicing who sort of wore the hat of Dada architects, though the ideas did influence many contemporary designers of the time. In the case of De Stijl, though, we do have architects actively working in this realm. So while Mondrian's work adhered to strict principles of neoplasticism, van Doesburg, he wanted to broaden the movement's research projects into architecture, because he wanted to reconsider and reconceive the entire living environment. Now, a De Stijl picture represents a fragment of a larger project concerning space. Right? The house is an interior space, the city is an assemblage of houses, etc. The austere forms of dish deal are really quite well suited to geometric forms that were favored by some of the modernist designers in this period. And so one example of a building that took on this challenge of sort of a dish deal architecture is the Schroeder House by Gerrit Rietveld. And this is such a great quote from Rietveld. "We didn't avoid older styles because they were ugly or because we couldn't reproduce them, but because our own times demanded their own form. Their own manifestation. It was, of course, extremely difficult to achieve all this in spite of the building regulations, and that's why the interior of the downstairs part of the house is somewhat traditional. With fixed walls. But upstairs we simply called it an attic, and that's where we actually made the house we wanted." Unquote. Now, before Rietveld designed and built the Schroeder House, he had done quite a bit of furniture, and here you can see some examples. And what you'll notice right away characterizes this work is the use of the line and the plane, and also very simple coloration. So the color is used to enhance the planar and geometric qualities of the furniture. You'll also notice the use of Platonic geometries. Very rational, very, very clean and clear use of those geometric forms. We always like to pair together Piet Mondrian's composition with the red-blue chair by Rietveld, because they remind us of that translation from the two-dimensional painting to the three-dimensional chair, how that might be realized. Now, the Schroeder House that we'll be looking at for the next few images is the only building that's designed in complete accordance with the dish deal style, and it's marked by primary colors and pure ideas. A little tiny bit about the house. Upon the death of her husband, Mrs. Schroeder felt she needed to move into a smaller house with their 3 children, and she actually would live in this house until her death in 1985. Because the space was quite small, she wanted every room to be transformable. So the 2-story house contains a transformable kitchen, dining, living area, studio space and reading room on the bottom, and the second floor contains bedrooms and storage spaces, which are separated only by portable partitions, so that everything could be reconfigured as needed. He also, Rietveld, wanted to remove the duality of interior and exterior by, quote, destroying the enclosure, unquote. By this, he wanted to kind of blow open the box. And to do this, as you can see here in these images, he devised a system of planar elements acting both horizontally and vertically, hinged by a thin metal frame for reference, so that the planes seem to exist in space. There is a bit here of a machine aesthetic, all these different elements kind of sliding into place. And here you can see some photographs. Notice the use of color and the emphasis on plane and line and point. Also the corner window, sort of dissolving the edges, blowing apart the box, so to speak. Again, remember that de Stijl is striving for the universal, right? Abstraction, precision, geometry. They're looking for artistic purity and austerity. The flexible space meant that there's no hierarchical arrangement of rooms in the floor plan. So the collapsible walls upstairs, positioned around a central staircase, were designed to provide the children with an option of pushing their partitions in during the day for an open play space and closing them at night for private bedrooms. And so those were the criteria that Mrs. Schroeder gave, that she wanted her children to have. The beds fit in 2 different positions, that each of the bedrooms should have access to water supply and drainage, and that all should have door to the access the outdoors directly. And here you get a sense on the upper level floor, there are no solid walls. As we saw or we read in Rietveld's quote earlier, on the ground floor he does have some permanent walls, and this was due to zoning requirements. But notice the zoning and the flexibility of the spaces. Detail was really well planned out here. So for example, specific paint colors distinguish different spaces or function. An interesting example of this is the front door, where black paint is used because Rietveld anticipated it would be accessed the most and would therefore be easily soiled, especially with 3 children. So what makes the Schroeder House an icon of modern movement is its radical approach to design, the use of space, and the purity of that De Stijl message. The concepts and ideas really represent the De Stijl movement. Structurally, a little side note here, it's made of reinforced concrete slabs and steel profiles, which is why we have the open corners, because the walls are not load-bearing. The walls are made of brick and plaster, and the window frames, doors, and floors were all made of wood painted in these colors to look more like metal. To preserve the strict design standards about intersecting planes, so important to De Stijl and to Rietveld, the windows are hinged so that they are only able to open 90 degrees to the wall. So it's no mistake that this building looks as if it were conceived as a 3-dimensional Mondrian painting. Now, Rietveld was not the only one who was interested in the application of these De Stijl ideas to space, but he was the only one to really create an architecture that represented it so clearly. Another figure I'll just mention very briefly here is Friedrich Kiesler, and he designed this installation for the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs in Paris in 1925. And what this is a suspended construction of wooden rails and flat planes that are meant to make a kind of elementary spatial grid. So you can occupy it. It's not a room, but it creates space. Kiesler referred to the installation as, quote, a system of tension and free space. And this space structure really serves as the ultimate conclusion of the ideas of De Stijl. Not surprisingly, De Stijl itself, with this idea of breaking open the box, does not lend itself directly to the wide application to architecture, where we need enclosure and we need walls. But the ideas seen here of the new conception of space, of the interest in abstraction to such a great degree, were tremendously influential. In the last slides of this lecture, we're going to look back at Mies van der Rohe. We met him in an earlier lecture, and we discussed his work as being defined, at least some of it, as being expressionistic. And this is particularly true in Mies van der Rohe, where he had different phases in his career. So here he's working in the traditional form. They're quite traditional housing. Then we saw these expressionistic skyscraper designs that were never realized until he immigrated to the United States and he was able to build some high-rises. And then we also looked briefly at this war memorial with the symbolism and sort of expressionist quality of the clinker stone bricks. In this lecture, we're going to look more at some of his later works. And so, one thing about Mies van der Rohe is he attempted to reduce all problems to a kind of essential simplicity. So the images on the right here are a very, very early project. So they nicely illustrate, paired with some of the later examples we'll look at, two opposing tendencies. The enclosure of function in a cubic container, right? And this comes from that neoclassical early phase of his career. And the articulation of the building in response to the fluidity of life. So how you move through space, the connections. And so some would say, and I've quoted this here, that his projects show a war between the struggle of neoclassicism and its objectification and the fragmentation that we've seen, say, with de Stijl and the neoplasticists. Mies van der Rohe's background in education is quite similar to Le Corbusier, and he did work in a neoclassical phase for 2 decades. It was only in his 40s that he completed his first modernist constructivist building. The war was pivotal. We can really say that before the war he was working in more of a neoclassical traditional mode, and then after the war he met a group of artists and writers, including Theo van Doesburg and El Lissitzky, and he is tremendously influenced by them. And so he started working on these different kinds of projects. And you can see here on the right some of these drawings. The abstractions, the plane, the line, right? The attenuated forms of pulling a line out into a landscape that might be a wall. And it might be a landscape wall, and then as it becomes part of the house, it is now a wall, an interior wall within the house. So looking at a few of his projects, this is the Tugendhat house. You'll notice that it is marked by white walls, glass, and steel. No longer see the individual bricks here. Instead, we've got it all rendered in painted white to look like a single volume. So it's a monolithic cubic mass. It's got a setback, right? So you can see more of a fragmented upper floor. Since this is on a slope, you actually enter on that floor from the street side, which is on the reverse of the image. We're looking at the garden side of the house. So this is kind of a mixing of some of his different tendencies. The use of floor-to-ceiling glass walls. So the cubic volume is very clear here, but it's almost totally transparent because of modern technology, the glass and steel. On the inside of the house, you can see his use of material. He particularly liked to use beautiful stone walls, onyx, marbles, and fine woods. You'll also notice the modern furnishings in this home. Mies was one of the designers that we will see who actively designed at all scales. The floor plan of the house, you'll notice the grid. Most of the enclosed space within it conform to that grid except in very specific circumstances. So for example, the semi-spiral stair and also that curved wall of the dining space, which we can see in the upper left image is that wood curved wall. Mies went on this sort of theme even further when he designed the German pavilion for the Barcelona International Exposition. We often call this the Barcelona Pavilion just because it was located in Barcelona, but it was actually for Germany. In this particular project, and remember it's not a house because it was a pavilion for people to come and learn about Germany, the enclosing cube is completely gone, and the entire space is defined through independent horizontal and vertical planes. The roof is supported by an independent grid of columns. They're very, very slender, and so they are assisted by the wall planes themselves. Here you can see the deep overhanging planar quality of the roof, the floor-to-ceiling glass, very abstracted. And on the interior, again, we can see the use of these beautiful stone walls, these sort of sliding planes that help to define yet do not contain the different spaces. Again, there's a column and then a very slender supporting wall plane of the beautiful stone. He liked to have the stone cut so that it was book matched, as you can see in the lower right. And this meant that the wall, the stone itself, becomes a form of art, a sort of abstracted quality of the stone. And sometimes when the light would shine on these walls, they would become sort of vibrant and animated with these different threads of color that move through the organic material. Again, that juxtaposition here of the floor grid, the stone wall, and that modern furnishings. Again, notice the grid even on the chair cushions themselves. Between 1931 and 1935, we know that Mies van der Rohe designed a series of houses which adopted kind of the Barcelona Pavilion plan type. When he came to the United States, he left because he was at the Bauhaus and he had to leave due to World War II. He began a number of projects in the U.S. that we'll look at very quickly here, and I hope most are familiar to you from HDE2. So this is the Farnsworth House. You can see, of course, the use of the grid, the plane or walls. We've got a complete loss again of that cubic enclosure. It's all glazed now, floor to ceiling. Nature is a dominant theme in most of his sketches. Here you can see some views where interior and exterior are sort of dissolved, a sense of where one begins and one ends. Very, very minimalistic here, very abstracted. And then the detail here of the cruciform column coming down into the grid, and then next to it, one of those stunning and unusual stone walls. A couple of other projects very quickly, just to show sort of the range of the work that Mies van der Rohe did in the United States. He developed a corporate office building typology. He was asked to design part of the landscape and master plan for the Illinois Institute of Technology, IIT, in Chicago, and he designed many of the buildings as well. This is Crown Hall. This is actually the architecture building. And what you'll notice here is that use of the grid. It's got a supporting truss system, so the entire building is hung by these trusses. You can see the deep truss along the roof here, which allows the interior space to be completely open. Notice the use of the I-beam as the ornament, but also structure. So he took very seriously Louis Sullivan's idea of form follows function. Clarity of detailing, very precise, expressive work. Here we have the Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago as well. You'll notice the grid, prefabricated elements to create the facades of these buildings. And he called this the skin and bones approach to buildings. So you can see the skeleton of the building, and the skin is that glazing. Each element in the project, from facade window detail to the grid of the plaza on which the two towers sit, they're all related to each other through geometric precision. He uses I-beams, and this product, now we're looking at the Seagram building in New York City. He uses the I-beams, as I mentioned earlier, to make these curtain wall facades, to have that rhythm and the clarity of the grid. In fact, these are not structural, they're decorative. Because of fireproofing, the structure needs to be encased. But in order to get that sort of machine engineering aesthetic and the clarity of that grid, he uses the I-beam here as a decorative element. And here's the Seagram Tower, probably the most finely realized of his skin and bones buildings. So thinking back to the early skyscrapers that we've seen in this course, here's an example of the tall building completely abstracted. There's no reference to history. What is expressed here is structure, material. And so when we talk about avant-garde and abstract art, in architecture, this is one of the ways that we see this most clearly realized.